everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I look forward to this afternoon's lecture. So I'm an assistant researcher and lecturer at the University Institute of Lisbon, and my research has been, and teaching as well, has been focusing on the last years on the green transition, and particularly how the green transition is or is not reproducing socio-environmental injustices, and how can we tackle those so that we really promote a green transition, and not just a transition that reproduces the same social inequalities and injustices of the fossil capitalism of our society so far. Within that larger research program, more recently, I've also coordinated some research projects that have focused particularly on the relationship between the green transition and far-right populism in Portugal. And so these projects have tried to explore and understand better how the way in which the green transition is being materialized, particularly in Portugal, but of course also in other countries, how maybe that is giving support in a way for people to vote more in far-right populist parties. In this regard, and I've been following the work of Professor Robert Huber and also of other researchers that have been discussing these issues with you for these last few days. And so, yes, I would like to now give the word to Professor Robert Huber, who is an expert in this area of populism and energy and climate change. He's a professor of political science methods at the University of Salzburg, and today he'll discuss with us precisely populist narratives on sustainability, energy resources, and climate change.
Thank you, Susanna, for the introduction and the kind words. I will try to share my screen, which I hope you can see now. Can you just quickly indicate whether this is working? Yes, excellent.
Yes.
Fabulous. Okay, perfect. So I'm really excited to be part of this program, because when I started studying populism and climate change, and that was like in 2016-ish, there was not much on that. There was not much research conducted, and there were not many opportunities to learn more about this potential link between two concepts that are quite pressing in our societies. And so I'm really excited there is a whole week of education dedicated to this topic that allows you to learn different perspectives. And if I may say so, I struggled a bit with preparing for today, because I saw that there were so many fantastic lectures before on topics that are related, of course, right? So I hope you still find it interesting and not too simple, what I'm going to present now. But I think this is really good that we have this opportunity to learn a bit more from different angles as well. The title of the presentation is Populist Narratives on Sustainability, Energy Resources, and Climate Change. I will try to keep it a bit more political science and a bit more theoretical in the beginning, particularly. So let me motivate this whole talk and presentation. When you talk about climate change and populism, quite often Donald Trump pops up. It's quite hard to avoid. And this is a tweet a long time ago. This was 2012 or 2013, so well before he decided to run for president. And here he says, well, oh, it's great freeze, coldest weather in years. Is our country still spending money on the global warming hoax, right? So there is something in there beyond just confusing weather and climate change, but there is also something about what that leads up to. Why do they invest money in certain things that we should maybe not invest money into? But this is not a lecture just on Donald Trump, just to to keep it interesting. That's Thierry Bourdieu. Maybe some of you know him or have heard of him. He used to be the leader of the radical right in the Netherlands, in the Forum for Democracy, which at some point looked a bit like replacing the PVV of Geert Wilders. And he, in this speech, criticizes that they are spending billions just to decrease the global warming by 0.0007 degrees. It's all a suicide note. It's all madness. Why do we even invest this money? And we already see some commonalities and differences between those two tweets, and we will explore them towards the end of the lecture in more detail, right? Both are about climate change. Both are skeptical, but on different levels with different connotations potentially, maybe reflecting on potential differences between these actors as well. Again, Donald Trump, global warming was just invented by the Chinese, right? But here the frame is very different from the first one. It's not like coldest winter in years and it's all a hoax. Here it is. It's also a hoax, but it's about economic prosperity, right? About economic competitiveness. A very different take, despite being the same actor. And then maybe to kind of conclude this, Marcel de Graaf, who used to be in the European Parliament, criticizing the European Union for making money and robbing the taxpayers with green lies, with where fat cat ecocrats, which is a quite interesting creation of words, benefit from the billions raised on your bills, right? So here the notion is yet different. It is climate change policy is bad. And why is it bad? Because it betrays the people. So we already see from like 4 examples, we have 4 different narratives or stories in here, which is quite interesting. And so to summarize, populist politicians seem to raise skepticism about climate change on these anecdotal examples. And I'm sure you're not surprised because you had a whole school on this the whole week, right? And that the question is a bit, why is that? And here comes maybe the methods professor in me who doesn't want to simply describe the world and say, well, it seems these actors say these things, but I want to understand a bit better, why is this the case? What are the underlying patterns and the underlying mechanisms that seem to matter here? And this seems particularly important because of this picture. And the thing I found quite fascinating, also in your presentations earlier today, is that the yellow vests reappear from time to time. They are a focal point of our discussions, partly because they have demonstrated to governments that they can really get punished if they get climate policy wrong. And so in a way, this may also mean that climate politics partly is much more on the agenda of right-wing populist parties or populist parties more generally, because it's more politicized. It's more in the center of the political debate. There is another aspect that I want to emphasize, and that is the sign here. It's just to zoom in. Maybe you can see the sign a bit better. Resolution is not fantastic. But here it says, I want my democracy now. And I find this really important because it emphasizes that some people think that climate policy is not democratic. It's not democratically legitimized at all. And this is interesting when you think of protests that violently protest at the heart of France. It's a bit surprising that you call for more democracy, but it also outlines that for some people, climate policy really feels out of touch with their everyday needs. Again, linking back to potential narratives. And all these examples are mostly from movements or parties that at least lean to the right. With the yellow vest, it's a bit less clear because it's a very heterogeneous movement, but neither Trump nor Bourdieu nor Marcel de Graaf are close to being left-wing, right? So maybe it's just that they're right-wing. That could well be the case. However, there are also recent examples like Chassel and Dine that suggest that left-wing populists may foster green populism. And I think you had a lecture on this actually as well, talking a bit about green populism. So let's explore the various reasons why this is the case and try to a bit more scientifically disentangle this. In the slides that you should be able to receive, the citation should be right. I'm sorry, they seem to be messed up on my slides here. So basically, this presentation has 3 parts. It has a theoretical dimension that I want to discuss first. What is it about climate change? What is it about populism that could link those two? Then I want to question, well, what kind of evidence do we have? Are populists really systematically different? And I hope by the end of the theory, it's clear why populism is not the same thing as, say, the far right. And then finally, let's try to identify some patterns in the narratives. What's going on there? I already teased it a bit in the beginning, depending on how quick we are with time. We may have some time to talk about this as well, otherwise in the Q&A, of course. So why should populists be skeptical about climate change? And I want to start with this this representation by Van Rensburg in 2015. And he distinguishes the core climate skepticism from other ancillary dimensions. And I think this is quite important because it also emphasizes where populists can easily find targets, right? So basically, in his view on climate skepticism, but I try to use this framework a bit more broadly, he argues that some aspects that relate to climate change are really related to the evidence, to the trend, is climate change happening or not, to the cause, who's to blame for climate change, but also the impact, right? What's the impact of changing climate for us? And that's what we often associate with climate skepticism. And that's a good starting point, but I think this falls short of giving us the systematic categories where populists unfold their effects. Because there are at least 2 other dimensions. There is the process and the response. And the process very much focuses on scientific knowledge generation processes, but also climate decision-making processes, such as the question, is this democratically legitimate? Is the Parliament or the European Union or the UNFCCC the democratically legitimate actor to decide on which climate policies to implement? And the same with the scientific knowledge generation process. Populists have been increasingly skeptical, and we will see in a second why, about scientists, about the power that scientists hold over what's true or what is not. And then at the end, of course, the question that we often ask and that came up in your presentations earlier today is, well, which policies do we actually choose? And maybe some policies are more likely to be opposed by populists than others. I'm presenting this, I'm sure you have seen this or similar categorizations in the past, partly to emphasize that this is much more complex and more nuanced than what we often think. Particularly in the Western world, the US aside maybe, we don't see a lot of trend skepticism. In Austria, where I'm based, it's a rare thing that people really deny the existence of climate change. That may be different in your home country, of course. But we see much more variation in the trust in science. We see much more variation in, do we find climate decision-making processes legitimate or not? And now that we've discussed climate change at least a bit to get a bit of a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about this, what causal mechanisms actually link populism and climate change? And as said before, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence of right-wing populist parties, right? Particularly in Europe and the US, where we can easily identify individual actors who have been quite skeptical about climate change. But what is it essentially about populism that links to climate change? So this kind of necessitates the question, well, what's populism? And this may depend on 2 aspects that I want to emphasize. One is what we mean when we talk about populism. This may lead to different understandings of why these actors could oppose climate action. But then also the other causal mechanisms through which these may or may not operate. So let's try to think a bit about what populism is, and I hope this is not too boring and you're not too aware of these different debates. So that's the definition of populism as a political strategy. That's one of the three big strands of how we can understand populism. That's based on Kurt Weiland. And he argues that populism is a political strategy through which a personalistic leader exercises power with direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large number of unorganized masses. We already immediately see this kind of definition operates on a political leader or movement level, right? The individuals do not quite fit into this definition. But it also emphasizes that this is something we see quite often outside of the Western world. Right? Latin America particularly has seen this definition a lot because their party systems are much weaker, and therefore it's much more likely that there are individual leaders that connect, quote unquote, the masses to gain power. So there's a strategic logic here and a very personalistic leadership in this definition of populism. There's this direct mass appeal nowadays for social media where they try to create a broader platform, and weak institutionalization, meaning that these movements often collapse if the leader is gone. Importantly, when we think about this definition of populism, in my opinion, it doesn't contain too much information about how these actors should think about climate change. It could, as we will see in a second, but it's not very obvious. It's maybe more in a case-based dimension. There's a second definition, populism as a style, that goes back to Benjamin Moffat. And they see populism as a political style which is performative, where political actors try to connect with the people by behaving in certain ways. For one, this is this typical people versus elite kind of appeal. And this definition shares this with multiple other definitions. But then there is also this performance, this provocation, this transgressive performance and bad manners, right? So behaving in certain ways in order to signal that you are not one of the elites, but you're different. Think of Boris Johnson, for example, who very intentionally wore his hair the way he wore it and had a tie that didn't quite fit for reasons of signaling and demarcating himself from the typical elites. Same with Donald Trump, the way he presents himself, etc. And there is this constant definition of crises, of breakdown, of threat. And so we can immediately see that some of the tweets that I showed in the beginning may fall into this. Are we spending money on something that doesn't exist? Is it worth that? Are we threatening our competitiveness by doing this? And if we think a bit more systematically, we will also see that the opposite is actually possible as well. So that's defining populism as a style. I think here climate action may play a role as a role of transgression, as in the role of provoking, demonstrating that one is different. So denying climate change, not because one believes that it doesn't exist, but much more because one wants to distance themselves from the quote-unquote mainstream elites. And then lastly, and this goes back to Cass Mudde and Kirk Hawkins, etc., populism as an ideology or as a set of ideas, right, where we think of populism not as a style of how to behave in politics or as a form of organization, but much more as a way of how one thinks about the world. And this way of thinking about the world usually structures around two groups. It's the people on the one hand, it's the elite on the other hand, and there is a struggle between those two. And the characterization for populists differs quite strongly between those two groups. On the one hand, it's the good and pure people who have this volonté générale, this general will that needs to be implemented in politics. And then on the other hand, we have the evil, corrupt elite, self-serving. And populism really excels this tension between those two. And here is already much more obvious, at least in my view, how this may link to climate change. That populists or people or parties who think like that about the world may actually think that there is this evil, corrupt, self-serving elite that's not doing what they're supposed to do and do not either implement climate action at the expense of the people, but potentially also vice versa. Right? So these different definitions lead to different causal mechanisms. I hope that most of you are aware of what I mean with a causal mechanism, right? As a more political science or sociology term, maybe, or econ term, right? So the idea that one leads to the other, right? That there's changes in populism that lead to changes in climate position. And if we think of the strategy bit, or the strategy definition of populism, then climate positions and narratives should be a mobilization tool, right? There is no underlying reason why this kind of definition would mean certain positions on climate change beyond trying to mobilize the masses through making claims about this, which is plausible potentially. Second, when we think about political style, populism as a political style, climate positions are either a crisis or a provocation tool to demonstrate that one is different. Potentially here one could think of Bernie Sanders, and we will see him later on the slides as well, as somebody who very explicitly talks about the climate crisis through a populist lens, which is quite interesting. And then lastly, populism as an ideology. So here the positions could be really a function of how they see the world as evil elites trying to get their way, such as Marcel de Graaf has defined this earlier on the tweet. In addition, there are other causal mechanisms. And I'm emphasizing this because we often fall into the trap of saying populism and meaning the far right. And Bernhard Fortner, who was here earlier today, is one of the leading experts, of course, on the far right in climate change or the environment. And this is not the same thing. And that's really important to disentangle this, right? Because it could well be that Donald Trump is so climate skeptic because he's right wing, or because he's authoritarian, or because he's nationalist. And it has nothing to do with his view of the world as good people versus bad elites, right? So disentangling this seems really, really important. And that's why I emphasize that host ideologies are not the same thing as populism, right? A party may be right-wing or left-wing, and those are different causal mechanisms, right? So for example, economic left-right positions, particularly strong left-wing positions economically that we see among left-wing populist parties, may have certain implications for the climate positions of parties. For example, oh, we don't want climate action because it comes at the expense of the working class. Or some people will lose their jobs because they're working in industries that are more heavily affected by climate policy. Authoritarianism or nationalism, nativism, which we usually associate with more right-wing populist parties, or the far right, as you may have called that with Bernhard Fortner, may also have effects, right? If you see the world in a more authoritarian sense, and there is a right way of doing things, and everything that diverges from that is bad and needs to be punished, which is one of the standard definitions of authoritarianism, then you can see that, for example, veganism or substantial changes to the way we live our lives may be seen as a violation of traditional ways of life, and therefore have their own effects that are not necessarily rooted in populism. And with nationalism, the same, right? Some of you in their presentations also mentioned the international dimension of climate politics. There it's very obvious why nationalist party may be a bit skeptical about actually supporting a global policy to prevent climate change or mitigate it in certain areas of the world that are quite far away, for example. Again, this is not populism. I think disentangling this is really, really important. Of course, other things play a role, such as are parties in government or not, right? Parties can promise a lot when they're in opposition. Doing them in government may be different. But then also party competition may matter. What positions do other parties take? What coalitions are there available, etc. May also affect how parties talk about climate change, but also how parties perform in this regard. And thus, kind of to stop the theoretical argument, or to end it here, is we really need to disentangle this. We need to disentangle what is populism and what are other things that are related to populism that reappear again and again, but are not necessarily the same thing. So what do we know so far? I wanted to very briefly present you some not publicly available data yet from an expert survey that I did that tells us a bit about what we know about the effects of populism on climate positions of parties, not on citizens, but on parties. And this is an expert survey that I conducted with 2 colleagues for 31 European countries. Again, the Eurocentrism that I mentioned critically is also reappearing in this data. And this was fielded earlier in 2023. And essentially, what we do is we ask experts, this is usually political science professors, to rate different political parties in the country they live in and their positions on all kinds of things, including populism and climate positions, to get a systematic understanding of how maybe the degree of populism of a party may relate to how climate skeptic this party is or how supportive it is of climate science, for example. Importantly, the expert survey delivers a reputational measure, and I think this is quite important to emphasize. So this is not an absolute measure of where parties stand, but rather what experts think where this party stand. This has advantages because experts know all kinds of things beyond the manifesto or speeches of individual members of the party. But then on the other hand, some of these things are reputational and may not pick up, for example, on change of the party's position. Exactly. For example, manifestos or party manifestos may be not the best way of doing this, but we can debate this, of course. And we measure populism here through this ideological leaning more. Partly, I'm a bit skeptical, as I've outlined before, that these other 2 definitions hold that much. Systematic power over how these parties should, or explanatory power of how these parties should relate to climate change. But this is very much in line with a standard operationalization, right? So their attitudes towards elites are in there, the attitudes towards the people is in there, and whether there's a general will, etc. Very typical standard measure. And maybe more for your reference. For climate positions, we had a module that included 2 questions. One was on climate policy, where we asked experts to rate the extent to which parties prioritize gains from climate policy over short-term socioeconomic costs or vice versa. So giving us a sense of, do these parties, even despite short-term costs, support climate action, or whether they do not fulfill climate promises and stop earlier because of the short-term costs that this may induce. And the second question relates to a different dimension, namely to climate science, and whether parties support a stronger role of climate science in climate policy making or not. Trying to get into 2 different dimensions that relate to the response skepticism and the process skepticism maybe, and not so much into the evidence of climate change. And that's both captured in a scale from 0 to 10. Okay. I'm very aware of time and it being 6 on a Friday evening, so I will try to speed up a bit. Here in this graph, you see multiple dots. Each dot is a party. On the x-axis, you see the degree of populism for each party. So the more to the right of the screen they are, the more populist they are. On the y-axis, you see the support for climate policy, means the higher a party, the more supportive it is of climate policy. And then we see a trend line with a downward slope, right? So this would tell us that on average, in this data, the more populist parties get, the more climate skeptic they get in terms of not supporting climate policy. We see a very similar picture when it comes to climate science. Again, similar kind of graph, but just with this different question on the role of climate science. We see, interestingly, when we compare those 2, that the support for climate science in policymaking is higher than the willingness of parties to trade off short-term economic costs for long-term gains for climate action, which I find quite interesting. All right. But then you may say, well, actually, what you show me here is just left-right differences between parties. That could well be the case because we know that parties on the right and on the left end of the political spectrum tend to be more populist. So what I did in this graph is I tried to split the different parties into three groups. Those that are more in the center of the political spectrum, those that are more to the right, and those that are more to the left. And what I find quite stunning, and what runs a bit against this narrative of left-wing populist parties being a force for climate action, is that in all three groups, we see a negative slope of this regression line that we put into the data, meaning that the more populist the party gets, the more skeptical they are about climate policy, and the more they emphasize the short-term costs. Of course, this may mean among the left-wing parties that we compare left-wing populists on the one hand to green parties, but that's a fair comparison because they're equally left in a way. What we find is that on average, according to this data, left-wing populist parties are not that much more progressive when it comes to climate action than conservative or centrist parties that are not populist. A quite striking finding, I find. And we see a similar kind of pattern when it comes to the support for climate science, actually. Of course, one thing that we need to emphasize as well is that these blue dots, so the right-wing populist parties in the corner here, and the right-wing corner, bottom right corner, they are much more skeptical than their left-wing counterparts. But again, that's not the effect of populism, that's the effect of left-right orientation that's different. So again, trying to be analytically as precise as possible. Of course, there's more literature. There is a case-based literature, and in the slides that the organizers have, there are a couple of references to them, but also there is a strong literature on the demand side, so on citizens' views on climate attitudes, where we find quite similar results. But there are limitations. There are limitations in how credible this causal inference is, and there is this Western Europe focus, which I find quite problematic. And some of you in your presentation earlier emphasized other cases where I believe some of the learnings may not be as applicable, simply because, for example, Modi operates quite differently when it comes to climate change than the typical right-wing populist actor in Europe. All right, so coming to the last part, and then maybe a bit more experimental part, I wanted to show you a series of tweets, some of the messages, some of those we've seen already, some of those we have not, where I want to emphasize some patterns or some ideas on how populism can be used in this realm and how it may be used to justify or delegitimize climate action. We already talked about this one, Donald Trump, right? And clearly here, this is about a skepticism about climate change. It's a hoax that there's still money spent on something, and he confuses weather with climate change, something that we see quite often, right? Oh, it has been rainy for a week. Why are we spending money on something? Here it's different, right? So here it is already about the effectiveness of climate measures. Thierry Baudet, and again, just trying to translate, we spend billions to decrease the warming by 0.0007 degrees. Basically saying, we talk a lot about climate action, but actually our action doesn't change much. Maybe also implicitly saying that it's not really down to humans, right? That's a very different way of accusing elites of spending money on something that's not worthwhile the effort, actually. Again, Donald Trump, we already talked about this earlier today. Here, this is much more about the economy and how the economy may suffer from climate action, which is, again, a narrative that we see quite often when it comes to populist parties. But this may not be as much a function of populism per se, or only in combination with certain right-wing economic positions, such as free markets, competitiveness, etc. And here, and then I'm done with those that I had before, emphasizing how climate policy is green lies, where the consumers suffer, the taxpayers in this case here, suffer from climate policy. A narrative that's also quite strong, particularly among right-wing populist parties. But moving beyond these examples, in France, there has been the debate about end of the world versus end of the month, right? That Macron tried to address, and this is a screenshot from a newspaper article discussing this, because the Yellow Vests quite explicitly criticized the climate policies of Macron for a variety of things, but also for not considering the economic dimensions for a lot of citizens. And this is what started the whole movement and the whole debate, right? The Socialist Party in the Netherlands has criticized that it's the big polluters and the elite with all the benefits in their pockets and subsidies in their pockets that celebrate the current policy when it comes to climate change, potentially criticizing the lack of serious, stringent climate action. And this is the same what Bernie Sanders says, right? Bernie Sanders was very explicit, and I really want to emphasize the last part of this poster here, right? It's take on powerful special interests. So on left-wing populists, among left-wing populists, we may hear two different kind of narratives. Either it is, or let's not harm the working class with too harsh climate policy. That's something we see quite often. But then we may also hear, like here, well, there are powerful special interests, such as the oil industry, that prevents far-reaching climate action, but we need more action. The people demand more action. And similarly, Podemos falls into this category, right? Criticizing energy giants that buy off politicians and that they need to be out of office and that there needs to be much more climate action that takes the people in the center. Again, a left-wing populist pro-climate statement, which I find quite interesting. And then lastly, popping up again, I think this is the last one that I have, is the AfD in its European Parliament election manifesto heavily criticizing Brussels for directly intervening into the personal lives of every citizen, bypassing all democratically elected and legitimized national parliaments. So really strongly criticizing how Brussels could even think of implementing far-reaching climate action. Again, emphasizing this notion of nationalism, but also democratic legitimacy that's quite essential to a populist frame, potentially. So to conclude and bring everything together and not be too much over time, there are good arguments to think that populism, however defined, could link logically with climate positions and climate narratives. Given the thin-centered nature of populism, so this chameleon-like nature that allows it to appear on the left or on the right, potentially also in the center, we see a variety of applications. So I want to emphasize, in theory, and with Bernie Sanders we saw this, we could have pro-climate populist frames that push for more climate action against the lack of support from political elites. Empirically, as the expert survey data that I've shown you demonstrates, we don't see this that often. It seems to be something that's more isolated here and there, at least according to the views of the experts that we've asked. What we most often see, of course, is this combination of right-wing positions with populism to have strong anti-climate narratives. I already said this. And there is a lot of variation, and we need to try to very systematically analyze this and disentangle the different underlying reasons for these different narratives and frames, considering economic factors and other factors as well, of course. With this, I would like to close and thank you for your attention. I know that we have a whole session, a Q&A in a bit, but I also wanted to offer you to stay in touch, write an email to me, or connect via Blue Sky or whatever you find useful if you want to continue this conversation. And I'll stop here and stop sharing, and thank you very much for your attention.